Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you and welcome to the Institute for Security Studies here in Pretoria. For those who are joining us online, thank you for making it a date with us on this seminar, which is going to be looking at this nexus between security and migration. But before we get into it, a few administrative notes. For those of you here, the restrooms are out the hall and to your left. And for those who have not been here before, obviously. And before I present the participants, I'd like to note that this seminar is being made possible with funding from the Hans Seidel Foundation and the German federal government, for which we are very, very grateful. We are also grateful for the support of the ISS Partnership Forum, which is composed of the Hans Seidel Foundation, the European Union, and the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States of America. Now, this morning, we'll be looking at the dangers of cracking down on migrants. And during this seminar, we would actually do sort of a tour de force, going through the current crisis that we are seeing in the Lake Chad Basin area, as well as the humanitarian crisis which is emerging in the Horn of Africa. And the research takes us to the intersection between what is understood as violent extremism and its humanitarian consequences on populations and different geographical spaces. After which, we're going to also look at the different institutional frameworks which are actually built to govern migratory processes. As you're very well aware, the media has turned its attention over the past couple of weeks on the issue of slavery in Libya, which is not very disconnected from the issues of migration that we are seeing. But before we get into the thick of things, and before I'm going to go ahead and present those from whom we will be hearing today. To my extreme right is Volker Owell from the German embassy here in Pretoria, and he'll be giving us a short word before we start with the panelists. And after his short word, we would hear from Emmanuel Mbiozo, who will talk for 20 minutes, and then we'd hear from Otilia Monganide, who's the head of special programs here at ISS. I am Fonte Akum, senior researcher in the Peace and Security Research Program. So, Volker, over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here today, and I would like to extend a warm welcome on behalf of the German embassy here in Pretoria. As Fonte has mentioned, Germany has been a partner in this endeavor and has been funding the research studies by the ISS on migration and violent extremism we are going to hear about today. So you might be wondering, or maybe it's obvious, why Germany is funding such a rather specialized research. I think there are a number of reasons why we do that. First of all, I think migration is one of the issues that have come to dominate many policy discussions, not only in Europe but also in Africa. And the recent days has been testimony to that. When the heads of states and heads of government gathered in Abidjan this week for the AU-EU summit, migration was one of the most prominent topics for their discussion. Secondly, migration policies, that means questions surrounding who's entering a country, when, how, and for which purposes, have been at the core of national sovereignty for a long time. But increasingly, societies around the world notice that the topic is much more complex than national sovereignty. And with that often comes fear, portraying migration as a security challenge. As far as we know, links between migration flows and violent extremism have rarely been explored. At best, there seemed to be anecdotal evidence. At worst, there were prejudices, stereotypes, and even xenophobia. Policymaking, however, should not be guided by anecdotes or guesstimates, but it should rather be fact-based. Therefore, we are more than happy that we have been able to partner with the Institute for Security Studies to fund that important research, and I'm really looking forward to learn about the results today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Volker. And we're also very excited to be presenting this first part of our research in migration. Emmanuel, are you ready for us now?
I guess so.
Please.
All right. So I'm going to be one of two presenters, as Fante did explain. I'm going to talk a little bit about the securitization of migration, but my focus is going to be on refugees specifically. When we were given the topic of migration and violent extremism, it's exceptionally broad. Both sides of the debate, there's a huge depth of knowledge about migration and about violent extremism, but very rarely are those two sides in a room. It's also often opposing sides, so people will come either with a view for freedom of movement or with a view to securitization. Or with a view of security. So it's still very much a new conversation that's happening, and still also very reactionary. One of the good things that we did start to see, we only started this research ourselves in 2017, and between the beginning of the year when we started looking at it and the end of the year now, you are starting to see more publications, more experts speaking out on the issues, so that it's starting to become, there is a little bit more evidence about it. So there are 245 million migrants in the world. 65.6 million are people of concern, so that's refugees, internally displaced people, and asylum seekers, broadly speaking. 20 million being refugees. This is to say that refugees actually make up a very small portion of migrants, but this photo in and of itself is proof of how much we're now linking refugees with migrants, because this was the very first image that came up on a Google search for migrants. Refugees have become synonymous with the migration. And especially on this issue, I would say. So there's been a disproportionate reaction towards refugees as a threat for violent extremism. There are a lot of red flags about the vulnerabilities of refugees, and I don't just mean in terms of perpetrating violent extremism. We mean in terms of the impacts of the policies and of the conditions, and that's some of what we'll be talking through today. Definitions are a very important topic, but we're not going to go through them all today because I only have 20 minutes. But in Africa specifically, the 1951 states participate in two conventions: the 1951 UN Geneva Convention and the 1969 OAU Convention. And I'm bringing this up because the Africa Convention is very important because it built upon the 1951 in terms of it applies to a much broader category of people. And it's a wider definition applying to a broader category of people. And that's important because in other parts of the world, the distinction between refugee, asylum seeker, and migrant, etc., is very important. But in Africa, this definition lends to prima facie, so refugees who are accepted on arrival. So there are more countries in Africa who have open door policies. So the distinctions between asylum seeker and refugee are slightly less across Africa than they might be in some other parts of the world. So we've seen some very harsh refugee policies come up in terms of securitization. Some of these are reinforced borders, border externalization, reduced quotas. Donald Trump has reduced they're the biggest resettler of refugees, and they've reduced theirs by 50%, America has. Prolonged or indefinite stays in camps, or in refused entries and forced returns, are some of the reactions that we've seen targeted towards refugees specifically. And a quote that was pulled from in the last year, it says that these pinched interpretations actually violate the spirit, the intent, and often the letter of international law. and they're most often justified by using language like security or risk or crisis. So when we looked at the issues, we decided there was a strong call to build the evidence base about these issues. It's a very broad, very confusing conversation. There's lots of experts in multiple places. The call distinctly among our colleagues was, don't point yet again to how big of an issue it is. Let's start building some cases. Let's start building the evidence base. So we're going to look at three of the case studies that we did today. The first is going to be focused on Cameroon and their practice in 2017 of forced repatriating Nigerian refugees. So just to contextualize this situation a little bit, on your map you have the countries that compose the Lake Chad Basin. It's one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world right now. There are 2.3 million displaced people in that region. And a lot of them are from Boko Haram. So Boko Haram poses the biggest security threat in that region, and they're responsible for displacing many of those people. So Boko Haram has expanded its focus. This is a table that's taken from an ISS database that shows that Boko Haram used to be a Nigerian, let me say more focused, to not upset the violent extremism experts, more focused on Nigeria. And in recent years, you can see that there's a distinct trend to export their violence. So they're now impacting more countries. And for the first time in 2016, a slight majority of their incidents were actually outside of Nigeria, 45% of which were in northern Cameroon. Also importantly, they've established an ability and a trend of being able to recruit local Cameroonians. Cameroonians' response, they held back on pushing back Boko Haram for a number of years, but have ramped up their military reaction in recent years. It's also a highly politicized issue in Cameroon as it is elsewhere. From a refugee perspective, Cameroon is a signatory to both refugee conventions, and they have a long history of actually hosting refugees. So they have historically taken in a lot from the Central African Republic. The Nigerian arrivals that have been welcomed, they all live in one camp, or they're all supposed to live in one camp, if we can say that, which is the Minowao camp. It has a capacity for 20,000, and the most recent estimate puts that 60,000 people are actually living there. Worryingly, and this is sort of the crux of this case study, Human Rights Watch published a report in September of this year, and it was built on some previous ones, estimating that upwards of 100,000 Nigerian refugees have been forced repatriated to Nigeria. Cameroon has said that they are they pose a security and economic threat, and that's one of the reactions. The returns have been violent. It's been documented that they've been included beating, and shoving and things of the sort. They're also hiding refugees outside of the camps, allegedly. And they're denying UNHCR access and refusing to assess the claims, or they're aggressively screening people and turning them back at the border. The Nigeria, Cameroon, and UNHCR signed a tripartite agreement in March 2nd, 2017, to agree to voluntary repatriation, and by the end of March it had already been violated. And that's when the humanitarian organizations started to speak out. So the outcomes of this practice are many, but one is it puts refugees at risk. So in northeastern Nigeria, the areas that they're being repatriated to, there are already 8.5 million people receiving aid. A lot of people are aid inaccessible in that area because of the Boko Haram threat. There is ongoing conflict and ongoing insurgency from Boko Haram. And there's reports of refugees dying on return, including a lot of women and children. So it's elevating the risks of those refugees and putting them right back into danger. Importantly, it's a contravention of law. So all of the refugee conventions are based on the principle of non-refoulement, which means that you can't push people back into areas of danger. And And that fits into a very dangerous trend, which is that the erosion of these frameworks to protect people. So if people don't abide by the conventions or if they contravene them, then the ability of those frameworks to actually protect people starts to erode. And that's a very dangerous precedent internationally, but also regionally, when you realize that some of the other countries in that region are also posing the same, are also facing the same threats from Boko Haram. So then if one neighbor starts doing it, what's to stop the other neighbors from start doing it? And also, importantly, it supports the extremist narratives. So one of the goals of Boko Haram is to spread their narrative. One of them is that the governments in this region are illegitimate and they're unable or unwilling to protect vulnerable people. So by doing this, you're actually lending credibility to what they say. In a context where you're shoving people back into areas that they recruit in. So, you know, there is definitely the possibility that this response is actually increasing the risk for more extremism among the people who are impacted by it. Importantly, and this will come up a lot, I think, and is a point that needs to continue to be made, is that it's a false narrative. So there's, as of now, there's no evidence that Nigerian refugees are actually perpetrating any attacks or any violence in the region. By pinning it on them, you're creating this false narrative, but you're also distracting from the real issue. So as we said before, it's been established that Boko Haram has already been successfully recruiting local Cameroonians. So pushing people back doesn't necessarily do anything to address the real issues. What they should do is implement very highly, and this is a standing recommendation around countering violent extremism, highly localized, evidence-based countering violent extremism programs for both locals and refugees that are really built on localized intelligence and very real threats in that area. Also, strong asylum procedures, and this is a very key point to this debate, is that strong, well-implemented asylum procedures actually have security properties. By definition, refugees are not people who perpetrate violence. They're people who are fleeing violence. That's the definition. If you're actually assessing people properly for that, then you're able to screen it out. We can't make that point enough. The next case study also looked at Boko Haram, but it looked at how Boko Haram is targeting displaced people. And this falls into a trend that is sort of changing what I'm loosely calling the currency of refugees. So you've already seen some countries, such as Libya, make threats towards Europe about if we don't receive X, then we're going to unleash refugees on your shores. Indonesia did the same to Australia. If you don't concede to our demands, then we're going to unleash this wave of migrants on you. It is potential that extremist groups are also starting to see that currency and might start using it, or might already be using it in their plans, if I can say that. So this case study argues that the reaction of the governments to these moving people could perhaps change how extremist groups apply themselves to migrant groups specifically. So in 2017, there's been an unmistakable change in Boko Haram violence where they're targeting more soft targets. So this includes a disturbing trend of women, children, and displaced people. This is also from an ISS database that shows the number of both attacks and deaths. So between 2015 and the first, how many months is that? 8 months of 2017, both attacks and the number of deaths on displaced people have doubled. So this establishes this as a trend. In addition to actually direct attacks on refugees, there's reports that refugees have been infiltrating flows. Whether or not it's a threat or whether or not it's true remains to be established. There are some cases. There are reports that among the returning refugees from Cameroon that some Boko Haram militants were among them. There have been reports of militants disguising themselves as refugees to gain access in or out of camps or villages. And this has the very distinct property of turning victims into suspects. and it increases a feeling of insecurity and diminishes the prospect of people helping one another. And this is really important in the context of northeast Nigeria, where more people are living, more of the refugees and displaced people are living in the communities than in the camps. So why is the perennial question, and I'm not going to pretend to answer it thoroughly, but this case study is meant more as a way of framing the issue to provoke more conversation. So there's some analysis into why Boko Haram has shifted its tactic to start targeting more women and children and soft targets, but nobody has yet isolated why displaced people. What specific properties do migrants have that might be valuable to extremist groups? One theory that's an American military background is called strategic coercive migration, and in short, it is where a weaker target leverages a weaker opponent leverages a stronger target with migration-related threats, basically. So go back to what I said about Libya. Libya potentially threatening Europe. Her position is that it happens a lot, but it's only one form of asymmetrical warfare, so it's not prominent in how we look at issues, but her theory is that it happens all the time. So by this theory, Boko Haram very much could be intentionally causing migration or targeting migrants as an ability to strategically leverage the enemy governments. So if we use Cameroon as an example, and Cameroon decides migrants or refugees are such a big threat, and Boko Haram, that when we just don't want them, and Boko Haram is in a position to either control or increase it, that gives them a lot of power vis-a-vis that government. Also, notably, Boko Haram has recently, in 2016, made an allegiance with the Islamic State. And the Islamic State has been investigated a little bit more for this property, and they have quite a bit of messaging targeted towards migrants. So if it's something that the Islamic State starts to do, it's possible that Boko Haram would also fit into that picture. So the outcomes of this behavior are that, some of the many, are that it turns countries against displaced people, as we've established with Cameroon. It turns communities against displaced people. And these are vulnerable people who have fled the violence, and it gives them nowhere to go. And Boko Haram is very punitive in its behavior, so it's shown a propensity to want to punish people who flee from them. This deepens their ability to govern through violence and fear. It also boosts visibility. So targeting soft targets like refugees has a particularly high profile response. And that, again, lends to some of the Boko Haram objectives. And it also, in Nigeria, they've claimed that there's claims that Boko Haram is no longer a threat. So a high profile media response helps them to establish that they are still a very real threat. Our final case study was a major paper that we did, and looking at the intersections of refugees and violent extremism. So there are historical cases where refugees have successfully been radicalized in numbers. So we wanted to take a look at two of the biggest refugee populations in the world and one of the biggest host countries in the world. And that led us to looking at flows of South Sudanese refugees and Somalian refugees into Ethiopia. So South Sudan has the fastest growing refugee population in the world. They are now over 2 million refugees, and it's flowing from civil war, armed conflict with a distinct ethnic violence tone, as it's being called. Somalia, the conflicts go back to 1991. Some of the refugees living in Ethiopia have been born there or arrived there as toddlers and have grown up in these refugee camps. It's also one of the biggest flows in the world, and they're driven by a multitude of factors. Ethiopia makes for an interesting case study because they're, in the last couple of years, unveiling much more progressive refugee approaches and refugee policies. They have an open door policy. And they've recognized, so they have, their development goals are to achieve a middle income status by 2025 or 35. Don't quote me on either of those. But they've recognized that the role that refugees can play in helping them to achieve their development goals. So currently there's a lot of aid dependency, and they're seeing the potential in refugees and helping them clear that aid, or reduce that aid dependency. Emerging from the 2016 Refugee Summit in New York City, they are being made a pilot country, or they've agreed to become a pilot country for the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. And that's an international framework that's trying to encourage integration, steps towards integration, and also just ultimately trying to spread the responsibility for refugees more equitably. Importantly, they've made, emerging from that summit, 9 pledges that are surrounded around things like getting people out of camps, getting more people jobs, getting them documentation, making sure that refugee children are accessing education. They're also, they are signatories to both conventions, and that's important, but Ethiopia does have a reservation around encampment. I've got a head nod over here. So all the refugees, even though it's open door, but they are kept strictly in camps. So some of the key findings, and this was a major paper, so it's very long. There's lots to say there, but some of the key findings vis-a-vis this conversation is that there is actually a low risk for violent extremism in both populations that we surveyed. So there's little activity, little threats of activity. There's a genuine disdain for extremism and extremist activity among the refugees, because that's what displaced them there in the first place. And they have a strong interest in cooperating with authorities against these threats. Ethiopia does have a very strong intelligence and security apparatus, and the refugees, according to focus groups that we ran, are very happy to play into that. And they incorporate refugees into their larger intelligence strategies. There's host relationships with communities in the area are described as generally good, and a lot of that is attributed to common ethnicities and common backgrounds. And Ethiopia really does manage this aspect well. Countering violent extreme programs in the region incorporate both refugees and community members because they are equally sort of positioned against the threat. It is important probably to state that Ethiopia has never had a major terrorist attack despite their activities within Somalia. Like they've gone to war with Somalia, and Al-Shabaab considers them an enemy. Some of the warnings that we picked up on is that the experiences of violence specifically on the South Sudanese side are extreme. So the violence that people were describing was very, very graphic. There are strong political alignments. So politics are actually banned within the refugee camps, but despite that ban, the opinions and positions that we saw in our focus groups alone were actually quite alarming. There are tensions in the South Sudanese side of the country, which is the west of Ethiopia. There are tensions by local communities. So the refugee population is at a threat of outstripping the local population. And that has very direct political implications in the region. So the population of Nuer people specifically is now overtaking one of the local populations. So there are some tensions there. There are high frustrations from all of the refugees that we spoke to, but specifically youth, about work and livelihood access. The conditions are safe, that we did establish, but they're also very poor, especially in consideration of the protractedness, so people who are being raised and staying there for generations. And there are now temptations for people to move onward in their migration. And some of the people expressed that that's where they might come into violent extremism recruitment, is en route up to Europe or into a third country. This is a point I just can't make enough. So 1% of refugees are resettled in third countries. And I make that point because it helps situate everything that I just said. So 180,000 of a 65 million person crisis are not being resettled, and yet the resettlement factor is what dominates a lot of the discourse on that. this. That means that they're in these types of camp situations, which according to some, like this quote is, "You don't want a situation where people are stagnating in camps year in and year out because you're creating essentially a hospitable environment for people to recruit extremists and criminals." So the impacts of keeping people in these situations are that it puts pressure on poor countries in close proximity to the conflicts. There are no durable solutions, and that's a line I'd like to start seeing more often. If third country resettlement isn't available and refugees in these contexts can't go home because of ongoing war, then durable solutions need to raise in the discourse. The risks increase where education, work, and freedom of movement are restricted, and the risk for extremism specifically. Large numbers of people for long periods of time, these also increase some of the risks. And the last point on this slide is that they're grossly underfunded. So the South Sudanese refugee appeal is currently at 10%, or it was 2 months ago when I checked. And in those conditions, whether it's violent extremism or violence or any bad thing, there's poor conditions. Good things don't generally come from poor conditions, if I can say it that way. So our final recommendations are, again, to have durable solutions that achieve humanitarian development and security objectives alike. So I think this is a point that we also can't make enough of, that these access to education, health, livelihood, and freedom of movement help achieve development, humanitarian, and violent extremism. These things don't have to be distinct. In fact, there should be an emphasis on bringing them together and achieving these things together. Countering violent extremism programs that are most effective are the ones that aren't necessarily framed as such. So if you provide everybody with education and work, that inherently drives these risks down. Making sure that they're holistic and coordinated and to include refugee input. And again, chronically underfunding refugees puts people in terrible conditions, and that increased the risk for extremism, among many other things. We talked earlier about false narratives and trying to stop that. Refugees are at no higher risk than other categories, and in fact less because they go through such a thorough vetting. One example that I did read in this research was, tourists actually statistically pose a bigger threat than refugees, and yet tourists move freely. And the answer to why probably has something to do with the bottom line as opposed to the real security risk. Again, strong and widely available asylum processes can help with security objectives. And Ethiopia is currently positioned to become a real example, and we encourage that. And my final point before I sign off is that this conversation, I think, needs to be handled very, very carefully, because it should be enough to want to help these people out of humanitarian concerns, but currently it's not. And we don't want to label refugees as violent extremists. That's a very important thing not to do because of the false narrative. But you still want to raise people's consciousness. And one scholar suggests that the only way to do that is to actually label some of these things as having a potential threat to people. But it's a conversation that has to be handled very delicately. And I'm done. Placeholder.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for that presentation. And I'll do a brief, make a few points while you think through to be able to present your questions and ask your questions once Ottilia would be done with her own presentation. Obviously, as Volker pointed out at the opening of this seminar, migration has made its way to the top of the international security agenda, partly due to the concerns that migration flows provide conduits for the spread of international terrorism. And Emmanuel aptly picked up from that to try to show that there are gaps in research that links international migration or human displacement to issues of violent extremism. And while there is a lot of research on migration, and there's a lot of research propping up on violent extremism, countering violent extremism, and the prevention of violent extremism, there is not much of a link between those, and that's what we seek to do through this research. Now, these are very complex issues with very complex dynamics. And what Emmanuel aptly did was to try to navigate the complexity of the different actors, the agencies, and the structures and process dynamics as well, which are shaped by the complexity of humanitarian conditions. And she goes ahead as well to look at some of the legal frameworks that are supposed to provide protections to refugees. But again, evidences the fact that there are actually gaps between the application, the existence of these norms and the application, especially in context where violent extremism is both a cause and consequence of humanitarian crisis. However, when we get to closer towards the conclusion, we realize that these crises largely take place on the margins of state. Margins of states where the absence of authority or the contested authority of these very states basically creates these humanitarian conditions that end up requiring international responses that go beyond the mandate or capacity of one single country, and therefore necessitates collaboration on the national level across borders to deal with them as cross-border issues, and also incorporates United Nations agencies to support these countries to respond to them. So I hope that I captured most of your presentation in these few points and would be able to talk about the other issues which were probably left out. And obviously the challenge is that push between the state's attempt to restore its authority and sovereignty by over-securitizing its responses to violent extremism, and the double victimization of the refugees who emanate from these crises, whether they're internally displaced or they are displaced across borders. So on that note, I'd like to invite Otilia to take another 20 minutes, 25, to go through her own presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fonte, and a special thank you to Emmanuel really for framing the conversation in a way that Volker alluded to, which is moving beyond anecdotes and discussing the ways in which policies and practices need to be shaped, not only around migration, but also around violent extremism, separately and where needed, together. I'm going to frame my presentation within current conversations and things that are ongoing at the moment, not only generally across the African continent, but in specific countries, and the ways in which, and in that, to draw from some positives as well as some negatives, and really looking towards what is the best way to be able to deal with the issues. And I say the issues, not so much the problems, because some of what I'm going to speak about is really to essentially disentangle the notion that migration in and of itself is a problem, but to identify what it is that either pushes people out of their countries and also what it is that in some instances fuels violent extremism. As Volker pointed to earlier in this week, yesterday and the day before, African as well as European leaders were in Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire discussing at the Africa and EU summit some of the key issues that they consider to be priority issues for both continents. While the original theme of the event was meant to focus really around the role of the youth, and particularly in development, but also peace and security, there was quite a lot in terms of the need also to address perhaps the elephant in the room, which was the migration issue. And in fact, for the most part, the discussions were about migration. But quite interestingly, the conversation that took over was a conversation around what is currently ongoing in Libya. It was a conversation about the criminality of smuggling. It was a conversation around the criminality of slavery. In the words of French President Emmanuel Macron, it was about looking towards a way in which you have concrete, military, he said, as well as policing action. but also looking towards an immediate and emergency extreme operation to evacuate the people affected. It was interesting language for me to hear, because for once there was a recognition that the people affected in Libya are victims. There was a recognition that the people that are carrying out the offenses, the smugglers, as well as the people in the slave trade, that those are the criminals. It was interesting for me because this is not the conversation that we've been having in respect of violent extremism, where there has been a conflation between the people moving and the people perpetrating crimes, almost as if the policies shaped around migration and violent extremism focus on potentially the 1% that may be committing crimes and not the 99% moving. And yet this week, according to African and European leaders, the problem is clear, and the problem are related to the violation of human rights of, believe it or not, Africans by other Africans through smuggling as well as the slave trade. I think it bears starting at that point because it speaks to what Fonte has alluded to as well as Emmanuel, which is around when developing the policies and trying to balance the security imperatives. I don't object to a response that deals with smuggling and a response that deals with the slave trade that uses a securitized approach. Because ultimately, when you are addressing these key threats to stability and to safety and security on the African continent, those are options within the toolbox. That being said, I think it is particularly important that in those responses, the people that are being worked to protect, so the migrants, actually benefit from that protection. So in this extreme emergency operation to evacuate the people affected, let those people actually benefit from it. In the concrete military and policing action, let the people who are perpetrating the crimes be addressed while not further marginalizing the people who were working to protect. And I'm mindful of the need for freedom of movement, but I'm also mindful of the imperatives of ensuring safe and secure spaces, and in many ways, the reason why, through sovereignty or otherwise, countries do want to protect their borders. It is about preventing criminal elements from being within their countries, but also from operating in the way that they are. It is about not only containing some of these criminal elements in certain spaces, but ensuring that, for example, if we deal with the challenges and the problems in Libya, we won't see them resurface elsewhere in the region. So I liked, Emmanuel, the way in which you framed the conversation around Boko Haram as not a Nigerian problem, but also quite importantly in recognizing the role that entities like Boko Haram as terrorist movements have in pushing people out. When we speak of migration, for the most part, we speak really about the people who have been forced to move, and then we also speak about those people who voluntarily choose to move. So we speak about the regular migrants, the people who apply for visas and try to get to places legally. We also speak about the people who struggle to get to their destinations legally, or who choose to use illegal channels to get there. The irregular migrants also include the refugees and asylum seekers that Emmanuel spoke about. So in developing the policies and ensuring that the policies are not so overly securitized that they affect some of the protected clusters, I think it is very important to have those categories clear. It is important that when we speak about whether or not we are responding and dealing with migration, we have to be clear what we are addressing. Are we addressing economic migrants? Are we addressing the mixed migration flows? Are we addressing the refugees and asylum seekers? Or are we addressing them as a whole? And once that is clear, it helps actually to be able to deal with each and everything in its turn. I often say that one of the challenges we've seen over the past 5 years with regards to migration is not so much that migration is a problem, is that migration management is not as easy when the numbers increase. So what you then have are challenges in dealing with, previously maybe at a border post you were getting 5,000 people entering in a day. And then, as happened in Uganda early on in this year or the year before, you find yourself dealing with hundreds of thousands of people fleeing conflict in a neighboring country, and you only have 10 border officials to deal with it. You need to be able to ensure their safety and security and their ability to be able to do their work, but you also need to be able to manage the systems and processes in a way that doesn't make it worse. And that's a huge challenge. It's a challenge that a number of countries are facing. But I'm going to offer one example citing 2 countries in which some of this can be addressed. In research that the ISS has done this year, we looked at specifically the policies in Algeria and Morocco around the regularization of migrants. One of the things was, because of the barriers of entry, a number of people who ordinarily would not be considered either as asylum seekers or refugees actually chose that route because they realized that applying on the basis of a work permit might be challenging. However, what both Algeria and Morocco realized, particularly in respect of their labor force, is that they actually did need more people in the agricultural sector specifically. So what they have sought to do, and not as a countering violent extremism strategy, but as a strategy related to migration that focuses on inclusion and integration and on leveraging the skill set that comes from people that are migrating from West Africa, is to say, if you do have particular skills that you were doing back home, you can apply for a regularization process, which means you're able to actually work within those countries. The unintended consequence, however, and a good consequence in that, is that there hasn't, even though there had been talk of people migrating, coming from countries like Nigeria, having been victims of violent extremism, potentially being at risk of being radicalized. What we've actually seen in both Algeria and Morocco so far is only one reported incident of a person possibly linked to a violent extremist group, and it was ISIL, not Boko Haram, which was interesting because initially the thought was that these people, even though they are fleeing violent extremism, if they come into a particular country, there were sentiments, particularly of the local communities, that they too might be extremists. But by rolling out a process in which their status in the country is regularized, a lot of the people then had economic opportunities and are moving away from being a marginalized cluster. And as a result, we've seen, at least in those 2 countries, they are, for the most part, free of radicalization and violent extremism in the way that we're seeing it elsewhere in the region. Those are important lessons to draw, particularly because these are lessons coming from African countries themselves. But that being said, and recognizing also what Emmanuel said in terms of terrorist groups like Boko Haram, for example, seeking to infiltrate flows, and I always have to remind people that criminals will be criminals. And criminals will manipulate various systems and structures to be able to carry out their work, whether it is to manipulate existing channels of movement or to try, as they do, to have various ways of recruiting that are online that completely transcend our borders. They will do that. But in trying to address the threats that are there, it is important to actually essentially pull them out from the whole and to identify the various criminals, and that does require an intelligence-led, rule-of-law-based, human rights-centered approach to addressing violent extremism, but that also recognizes the need to continue to protect migrants, and particularly those people who are already vulnerable because they have been forced out of their countries. The third point relates to whether or not we create policy looking and aiming at the 1%, or whether or not we're shaping our policies for the benefit of the 99%. Unfortunately, because populist rhetoric will be populist rhetoric, where you do have a single attack, and that single attack is perpetrated by a person who comes from a migrant community, it's an easy story to tell. It is easy to then say, look, we told you so. while at the same time ignoring the majority of people who either have been affected or, as Emmanuel pointed out, and I sort of underlined this as you were speaking, in the communities that are focus groups focused on the South Sudanese and Somalian refugees in Ethiopia, one of the main threads across that was that there was a strong interest in cooperating against violent extremism. Because particularly for those people fleeing Somalia, they recognized what violent extremism does to them. It displaces them and places them in contexts where they might not be as safe and secure as they would have wanted to. South Sudan similarly, where currently at the moment, both between Ethiopia and Uganda, we are seeing close to 2 million people having fled the country into neighboring countries seeking refuge. So their desire to cooperate to respond to violent extremism comes from their experience of what violent extremism can do. If policies that respond to violent extremism don't leverage that and actually focus then on people who have been affected and how they can contribute, all we will be doing is really trying once again to shape policies on the basis of the 1% and not the 99%. It goes then to the fourth point, which relates to how good and strong asylum processes actually help to ensure safety and security. So it is about properly vetting people, and it is about then being able to glean the people who are fleeing violent extremism, who are in the overwhelming majority, from those people who are trying to manipulate those channels. That's a difficult task. I go back to my earlier point. Countries that previously were only seeing entries of below 5,000, having to deal with tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in some cases millions of people, now having to process each and every single asylum seeker application with the same level of detail that they did when it was just 2 people applying. That's a lot of work that needs to be done. And perhaps the extreme and emergency measures in order to address some of the aspects also have to be employed in respect of the asylum seeker process. The last point, and I think this point relates to then what do we do, particularly on a continent where we are trying to promote freedom of movement, but each and every single country also recognize the need to secure their own territory, but also to ensure safety of citizens within their territory and other people. It is about recognizing the importance of proper border management. I'm not speaking about border security, but proper border management, which includes a security component, but it also includes having the right people at ports of entry to deal with the application and processes of people entering. In South Africa, for example, through the Interministerial Committee that deals with migration and urbanization, there's been a recognition that migration isn't just a function of the Department of Home Affairs. There's a recognition that, for example, the Department of Social Development, that then has to deal with people and offer social services, has to be involved and on board. There's a recognition also that Statistics South Africa, which really just deals with the numbers, also has to be on board and has to be able to know how many people are coming into the country and how many people are staying. How many of those people are regular migrants and how many of those people are irregular migrants? And what can be done in respect of the irregular migrants to allow them to be regular migrants? Because we've seen in a number of the communities, for example, people who are refugees who actually could be contributors to the economy but aren't. And I think there has to be a move towards policies that recognize that. Policies that recognize, whether we like it or not, that people will be on the move. And the challenge at the moment, from a policy-making point of view, is to ensure that we allow people to be able to move, but that we don't also do it at the detriment of state safety and state security. And in that, and perhaps my last point, is, and I pose it as a question to the people here in the room, but also to the online audience, which is we need to be asking ourselves in shaping our policies, in shaping our practices, we need to be asking ourselves, what is the problem? Is the problem migration? Is the problem violent extremism? Is the problem smuggling? Is the problem slavery? And once we have an answer to that question, and I'm not going to answer it, but once we have an answer to that question, then we look towards shaping policies and practices that respond to the problems and not to some of the things that come as a result of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Otelia, for that presentation within the time limit as well. I mean, it's a presentation which I think built up on the previous narratives about empirical gaps to try to seek solutions to this spectrums from forced to voluntary migration, illegal to legal migration, irregular to regular flows, poor to wealthy migrants, and how different actors, whether they are communities, national or regional actors, actually develop human rights approaches, which are centered to, which put the human, the individual, the migrant at the heart of the problem-solving process. On that note, I was wondering whether you would have questions in the audience, but before we go to the audience, I would like to thank our online audience. At this point, we would go off air and get into Chatham House rules to allow for an open discussion with those here in the room. And under the Chatham House rules, obviously, we hope that no individual would be quoted without their own accord, and what we say stays in this room and doesn't go out of it. Thank you very much.